My father leaned back in his chair fork, tapping lazily against the porcelain plate, and laughed. Not the warm kind of laugh that fills a room with comfort. The other kind. The kind meant to make sure everyone else laughs too. "You're still the same," he said loud enough for the entire dining room to hear. "Still chasing uniforms and medals like a kid playing soldier." A few people at the table chuckled politely. Then he added the line that made the room truly quiet. "She'll never amount to much. Some people just don't have it." No one defended me, no one corrected him. Because to them, I was just the disappointing daughter in a simple army uniform. But tomorrow morning when the doors of his office opened, his own boss would walk in, look straight at me, and say something that would make every fork at that table fall silent. "Good morning, Colonel." And in that moment, my father's version of the world would collapse. The dinner was supposed to be a celebration. My father's company had just been shortlisted for a major federal defense contract, one of the largest their firm had ever pursued. Whitman Defense Systems had been his life's work, built from a small consulting firm into a respected contractor supplying communication systems for military operations overseas. To him, it was proof of everything he believed in: ambition, reputation, control. The dinner was held in a private room at a restaurant overlooking the Potomac. Tall windows framed the city lights across the river. The table was long and polished, the kind of place where deals were often made before dessert arrived. My father sat at the head naturally. Executives from his company filled the seats beside him. A few investors, 2 senior project managers. And across from me sat a quiet man in a navy suit who had introduced himself earlier as someone from their federal liaison team. Everyone was dressed like they belonged to a boardroom. Except me. My uniform was pressed but simple. Army green service dress ribbons, aligned carefully above my pocket. No flashy decorations, no explanation. Most people at the table didn't know what the insignia meant. And my father had never bothered to tell them. He raised his wine glass as the waiter cleared the main course plates. "To Whitman Defense," he said, smiling confidently. 30 years of building something that lasts." The others echoed the toast. Crystal chimed softly. Someone across the table asked him about the contract evaluation scheduled for the next morning. My father leaned back comfortably. "Just another review meeting," he said. "Standard government procedure." He waved a dismissive hand. "Usually some mid-level officer asking predictable questions." The table chuckled. "Nothing we haven't handled before." I listened quietly, folding my hands in my lap. My father's eyes drifted toward me for a moment. Then he smirked. "Speaking of officers," he said casually, gesturing with his fork in my direction, "this is my daughter." Several heads turned politely. I offered a small nod. "She's in the Army," he continued. The tone of his voice made the statement feel like an afterthought. Someone asked kindly, "Oh really, what do you do?" Before I could answer, my father did. "She's still figuring that out." More laughter. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the old reflex of staying still when someone tried to define me before I spoke. My father had always been good at that. When I was a child, he told people what I liked before I discovered it. When I was a teenager, he told people what I would study before I applied anywhere. When I was 22, he told relatives I would come to my senses and leave the Army within a year. 20 years later, he still believed the same story. The executive across from him leaned forward. "What unit are you with?" he asked. My father answered again. "Oh, something small," he said lightly. "Nothing that affects the real decisions." The room laughed again. I took a sip of water instead of responding. Outside the window, a slow riverboat moved along the dark surface of the Potomac, its lights reflecting like scattered gold. I focused on that instead of the sound of my father's voice. "You know how it is," he continued to the table. "Some people just don't have the instincts for business." He tapped the table once. "She joined the Army because she couldn't make it anywhere else." This time the laughter came more cautiously. Even the investors sensed something slightly uncomfortable about the remark. But no one interrupted. Because in my father's world, reputation was gravity. It pulled every conversation in its direction. He took another sip of wine and leaned back. You're still the same, he repeated, looking directly at me now, still chasing things that don't lead anywhere. The words landed gently on the table, but their weight was familiar. I met his eyes calmly. Maybe, I said. He smiled, satisfied. The conversation drifted away from me after that. Contracts, market projections, supply chain logistics. The rhythm of knives and forks returned. But inside my head a quiet calculation had already begun. Because tomorrow morning, the review meeting they were discussing would not be led by a mid-level officer. It would be led by me. I had discovered the coincidence only 3 days earlier when the contract review file crossed my desk. Whitman Defense Systems. The name had stopped me cold for a moment. Not because I doubted my ability to review it fairly, that part was simple. But because I knew exactly how my father would react if he ever discovered who would be sitting at the head of that meeting. Across the table, the man in the navy suit spoke again. What building is the review taking place in tomorrow? Pentagon Annex, my father replied confidently. Early morning session. I noticed the liaison officer glance at me briefly. Just a flicker of recognition. He understood something the others did not. My father continued speaking about the meeting as if he owned it already. The evaluation team rotates, he explained. Usually someone young trying to prove themselves. The table laughed again. I watched him quietly. Tomorrow morning, the same man who laughed about that officer would walk into a conference room and discover that the person running the review was his daughter. But I didn't plan to reveal anything tonight. Not out of kindness. Out of discipline. Because soldiers learn something very early in their careers. The moment of truth means more when you let it arrive on its own. The waiter cleared the final plates. Dessert menus appeared. My father raised his glass again. To success, he said proudly. Everyone echoed him. To success. I lifted my water glass with the others. But I was already thinking about the conference room waiting across the river. The long table. The briefing folders. The moment when the door would open and my father would walk in. And someone, probably the senior general overseeing the session, would turn toward me and say the words my father had never imagined hearing. Good morning, Colonel. The thing about being underestimated is that after a while you stop trying to correct people. You just let them believe whatever version of you makes them comfortable. My father had been telling the same story about me for nearly 30 years. In his version, I was the daughter who had chosen the wrong road, the stubborn one. The one who had wasted her potential chasing discipline instead of ambition. In reality, the story had started very differently. When I was 10 years old, my father brought my brother and me to the top floor of his first office building. It wasn't much then, just 2 rented rooms above a law firm in downtown Arlington. But to him it felt like the beginning of something enormous. He stood by the window looking out at the traffic below and said something I never forgot. Success, he told us, comes from control. My brother nodded like he understood. I just watched the cars. My father had always believed the world could be shaped by people who were bold enough to claim it. And for a long time he was right. Whitman Defense Systems grew quickly, government contracts, private investors, expanding offices. By the time I was in high school, his company had moved into a modern glass building outside Washington. His world was built on meetings, negotiations, and reputation. Mine was built on something quieter. Discipline. The first time I considered the military seriously was during my junior year of high school. An Army officer came to speak at an assembly about leadership and service. Most of the students barely paid attention, but something in the way he spoke caught my attention. He didn't talk about glory. He talked about responsibility. You lead people, he said, by being the person who stands steady when everyone else is unsure. That line stayed with me. When I told my father I was thinking about applying for ROTC, he didn't react immediately. He simply stared at me across the kitchen table. You're joking, he said finally. I'm not. He leaned back, slowly studying me like someone trying to understand a strange decision. Why would you choose that? I tried to explain. Structure, purpose, the chance to lead. But the more I spoke, the more confused he looked. The military, he said finally, is where people go when they run out of better options. My brother laughed quietly from the other side of the table. My father continued. "Whitmans build companies," he said. "We don't take orders." I remember the silence that followed. Then I said the one thing he wasn't expecting. "I want to earn something on my own." His expression hardened slightly. "You already have everything you need." "Not that." The conversation ended there. From that moment on, the distance between us became something real. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was simply permanent. When my ROTC acceptance letter arrived, my mother hugged me quietly in the hallway. My father didn't say anything. Later that night, I found the envelope sitting untouched on the kitchen counter. No congratulations. No questions. Just silence. The years that followed moved quickly. Training, early assignments, long days that turned into longer nights. The Army had a way of stripping things down to their essentials. Who you were mattered less than what you could do. I liked that. The first time I came home after basic officer training, my father asked exactly one question. "How long before you come back to the real world?" I smiled politely. "I'm already in it." He shook his head. "You're wasting your time." He never visited a base, never asked about deployments, never came to any ceremony where rank was recognized. At family gatherings, when people asked what I did, he answered for me. "She's in the Army." Nothing more. Sometimes he added a quiet joke afterward. "She'll figure things out eventually." People laughed. I learned to let them. Over time, the distance between us became routine. Phone calls were short. Holidays were polite. My brother joined the company after business school exactly as my father had always planned. By 35, he was already running half the firm. My father spoke about him constantly. Daniel closed another deal. Daniel's leading the expansion team. Daniel understands how the real world works. I never resented my brother. Daniel simply lived the life my father understood. I lived the one he couldn't measure. The Army promoted me steadily. Captain. Major. Then Lieutenant Colonel. Each step came with more responsibility, more people depending on decisions that had to be made quickly and correctly. But none of those promotions ever made it into the conversations at my father's dinner table. Not because they were secret, because he never asked. The first time he accidentally learned about one of them was during a charity event in Washington. A retired general recognized me across the room. "Colonel Carter," he said warmly, shaking my hand. "Good to see you again." My father froze beside me. "Colonel?" The word hung in the air. After the general walked away, my father looked at me like someone who had just realized a book had been written without him. "You're a colonel now." "Yes." "How long?" "Almost a year." He shook his head slowly. "Why didn't you tell me?" I met his eyes calmly. "You never asked." That moment could have changed things. But it didn't. Because people rarely abandon the stories they've already decided to believe. To my father, I was still the daughter who had taken the wrong path. Still the one who had walked away from the world he understood. And in his mind, that meant I would always be the one who hadn't succeeded. Which is why the dinner the night before the contract review felt so familiar. It was simply the newest chapter in a story he had been telling for decades. A story where he stood at the center of everything that mattered. And I stood somewhere outside of it. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was that the next morning would place us both in the same room again. Not as father and daughter, but as two professionals sitting across the same table. One asking for approval, the other deciding whether it would be granted. The strange thing about family tension is that it rarely arrives all at once. It builds slowly, quietly. One small comment at a time until eventually something crosses a line that had been invisible for years. That dinner had started like many others. Polite conversation, expensive wine. My father at the head of the table guiding the evening the way a conductor guides an orchestra, confident that every voice in the room would follow his rhythm. But sometime between the main course and dessert, the tone shifted. And once it did, there was no turning it back. The waiter had just poured another round of wine when one of my father's executives asked about the upcoming contract evaluation. "So tomorrow's the big review meeting," the man said. "Pentagon Annex, right?" My father nodded casually. "Bright and early." Who's running the evaluation panel? Another executive asked. My father shrugged. Hard to say. The Army rotates officers through those assignments. He smiled, cutting a piece of steak. Usually someone junior who wants to prove they're important. The table chuckled. I felt the liaison officer glance toward me again. He was the only one in the room who seemed slightly uncomfortable. My father continued speaking. They'll ask questions about logistics, timelines, supply chain issues, the usual things bureaucrats worry about. He waved his fork dismissively. We've done these presentations dozens of times. Someone asked, is the Army pushing for any specific upgrades this cycle? Not really, my father said. They're just trying to justify their oversight budgets. More laughter. I watched him carefully. He wasn't trying to insult the military directly. He was doing something more subtle, something he'd done my entire life. He was making sure everyone understood that his world was the one that mattered. Across the table, one of the younger executives turned toward me. So, what unit are you with? He asked. Before I could answer, my father spoke again. She's still bouncing around assignments, he said. The executive smiled politely. What's your rank? My father leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying himself. Oh, nothing high, he said. The Army promotes people quickly when they're short on talent. A few of the investors laughed. I didn't react. The liaison officer cleared his throat quietly but said nothing. My father gestured toward me with his wine glass. You have to understand, he continued addressing the table. The military has a very different idea of success. Someone asked what he meant. Well, my father said in business, success means building something that lasts. He tapped the table for emphasis. In the Army, success means collecting ribbons. A few of the guests shifted slightly in their chairs. Not because they disagreed, because they sensed something personal in his tone. He looked directly at me now. You're still the same, he said, still chasing things that don't actually matter. His voice was calm, almost conversational. But the words carried clearly across the table. You could have come into the company, he continued, used your intelligence for something real. He spread his hand slightly. Instead, you chose this. The room went quiet. Someone tried to redirect the conversation. Service is admirable, the investor said carefully. My father smiled politely. Of course it is, he replied. Then he turned back to me. But eventually people grow out of playing soldier. The line landed harder than the others. Not because it was cruel, because it was deliberate. My father had always believed embarrassment was a form of motivation. If you pushed someone hard enough in public, eventually they would change. He had tried the same tactic when I was 18, when I was 22, when I was 30. Tonight was simply the newest attempt. You're still young enough to pivot, he said, almost kindly now. Come work for the company. Daniel could use someone reliable. My brother shifted awkwardly beside him. I met my father's eyes calmly. I'm doing exactly what I planned to do, I said. He sighed like a man dealing with a stubborn child. You're wasting your potential. The liaison officer spoke for the first time. He began. Then he stopped himself. My father didn't notice. He was still watching me. I just don't understand why you keep chasing a career that leads nowhere. The words hung in the air. For a moment, no one moved. Then my father leaned back again and gave the line that would echo in my mind all night. You're still the same, he said. You'll never amount to much. Silence spread slowly around the table. No one laughed this time. Even the executives who had laughed earlier now looked uncomfortable. But my father seemed completely satisfied with himself. He believed the conversation was finished. He believed he had made his point. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that tomorrow morning would place us both inside the same professional arena. Not as parent and child. Not as businessman and disappointment. But as contractor and reviewer. The liaison officer met my eyes briefly. He understood. I offered him the smallest possible nod. Across the table, my father picked up his wine glass again. To tomorrow's meeting, he said confidently. To success. The others echoed the toast. To success. I lifted my glass with the rest of them. But inside my head, a different thought had already taken shape. Tomorrow morning when my father walked into that conference room, he wouldn't see a junior officer. He wouldn't see someone trying to prove herself. He would see the person responsible for approving or rejecting the biggest contract of his company's history. And when someone greeted me with the title he had spent years pretending didn't exist, he would finally understand something he had refused to believe. That the daughter he had dismissed for decades had quietly built a career he had never bothered to see. The morning after the dinner arrived cold and clear. Washington has a particular kind of quiet just before sunrise, the kind that makes the city feel like it's holding its breath before the machinery of government begins moving again. I arrived early. That was a habit the Army had carved into me years ago. Being early wasn't about punctuality, it was about control, about stepping into a room before the pressure arrived, and understanding the terrain. The Pentagon Annex building looked exactly the way it always did: wide concrete corridors, secure doors, fluorescent lighting that hummed faintly overhead. Efficient. Unimpressed by anyone's ego. I checked in at the security desk and walked toward the conference wing, the heels of my shoes striking the polished floor in a steady rhythm. My uniform that morning was different from the one I had worn at dinner. Dress uniform. Dark green jacket pressed to sharp lines, rank insignia fixed cleanly at the shoulders, the silver eagle of a full colonel resting against the fabric with quiet authority. I had worn it hundreds of times before, but today felt different. Not because of the meeting, because of who would be sitting on the other side of the table. The conference room was already open when I arrived. Long rectangular table, 12 leather chairs, a large screen at the far wall waiting to display presentations. Folders had been arranged neatly at each seat. Procurement documents, performance summaries, compliance reports. The Whitman Defense Systems folder sat directly in front of the chair across from mine. Seeing the company name printed there still felt strange. Not emotional. Just strange. I took my seat at the head of the table and opened the file again. My responsibility that morning was simple in theory. Review the contractor's proposal, ask questions, evaluate the risk. Recommend approval or rejection. The Army didn't care about family connections. It didn't care about personal history. It cared about performance. And that was exactly how the meeting would proceed. Footsteps approached outside the hallway. One of the junior analysts stepped inside. "Morning, Colonel Carter." "Morning." He placed a tablet beside my folder. "Final evaluation notes are loaded." "Thank you." He nodded respectfully and moved toward one of the seats along the wall. A few minutes later, the door opened again. This time it was General Patterson. 2 stars on his shoulders, posture straight despite decades of service. "Morning, Colonel," he said, stepping inside. "Morning, sir." He glanced at the folders. "This is the Whitman defense proposal, correct?" "Yes, sir." He nodded. "Large contract?" "Very." He studied me for a moment. "You familiar with them?" "Only through the documentation." Which was technically true. He smiled faintly. "Well, let's see if they're as impressive as they think they are." The rest of the evaluation team arrived over the next 10 minutes. Logistics officers, procurement specialists, legal advisors. By 8:45, every chair along our side of the table was filled. The contractors would arrive at 9. I checked the clock on the wall. 8:57. The hallway outside began to fill with voices. I recognized my father's voice immediately. He always spoke with the confidence of someone who believed he belonged in any room he entered. "They'll want to hear about the production timeline first," he was saying. Another man asked a question about supply chain delays. My father answered smoothly. "We've already addressed that." I could almost picture him out there in the hallway, tailored suit, confident smile, briefcase in hand. The same man who had laughed at dinner less than 12 hours earlier. The door opened. The Whitman defense team entered. 5 people. Project manager, lead engineer, 2 analysts, and at the center of them, my father. He walked in mid-sentence, explaining something to the others. Then he looked up. For half a second, his expression didn't change. Recognition hadn't reached him yet. His eyes simply registered the people sitting around the table. Then they landed on me. I watched the moment unfold. Confusion first, then calculation, then something sharper. He hadn't expected to see me here, but he still assumed the explanation was simple. Maybe I was observing. Maybe I was assisting someone else. Maybe I was just another officer sitting along the wall. His gaze flicked to the head of the table, the seat I was occupying. The silence in the room stretched. General Patterson looked up from his folder. Whitman Defense Systems. My father straightened slightly. Yes. Please take your seats. The contractor team moved toward the chairs across from us. My father sat directly opposite me, still processing, still trying to understand the shape of the situation. The others around him were already opening laptops and arranging their presentation materials. General Patterson leaned back slightly. Before we begin, he said calmly, I want to introduce the officer leading today's evaluation. My father glanced toward him, then back at me. The realization was almost there now, but it hadn't fully arrived. General Patterson turned his head toward me. Colonel Carter will be conducting the primary review. The words settled into the room slowly. For a moment no one spoke. Across the table my father's posture stiffened. His hand froze on top of his folder. I met his eyes calmly. No anger. No satisfaction. Just the same steady composure I carried into every briefing. General Patterson continued. Colonel, the floor is yours. I opened the Whitman Defense folder. Thank you, sir. Then I looked directly at the contractor team. At ease, everyone. My voice carried clearly across the room. Let's begin. The silence after General Patterson's introduction didn't last long. Military meetings rarely do. Momentum is part of the discipline. Once a review begins, everyone in the room moves with the same unspoken understanding, focus on the mission, not the personalities involved. But the moment my father realized who was leading the evaluation, the atmosphere changed. Not for the others, for him. I could see it in the way his shoulders stiffened slightly and the way his fingers paused on the edge of the folder he had just opened. He hadn't said a word yet, but his eyes kept returning to the insignia on my shoulders. The silver eagle. The mark he had spent years pretending didn't matter. I flipped open the first page of the proposal. Whitman Defense Systems, I began, evenly submitted a communications upgrade package for the Joint Tactical Operations Network. The engineers on his team nodded immediately, shifting into presentation mode. One of them activated the screen behind them. Slides appeared: production schedules, manufacturing projections, cost breakdowns. For the next several minutes, the meeting proceeded exactly the way professional evaluations are supposed to proceed. Technical. Focused. Impersonal. The lead engineer walked us through their design improvements. The logistics officer on our side asked about delivery timelines. One of our procurement analysts raised concerns about supply chain dependencies. All standard questions. All standard answers. But every few minutes my father glanced at me again, trying to reconcile the two versions of me that existed in his mind. The daughter he had dismissed at dinner, and the officer now leading a room full of military decision-makers. Eventually, the presentation reached a pause point. The engineer finished his section and looked toward my father. He was supposed to take over the financial portion of the proposal. My father stood slowly. The confidence he usually carried into rooms like this was still there, but it had shifted slightly, as if the ground beneath it had moved. He cleared his throat. Our company has spent the last 3 years preparing for this contract, he began. His voice was steady. Professional. He spoke about manufacturing capabilities, supplier relationships, and cost efficiencies. Exactly the same way he had spoken at hundreds of meetings before. But there was one difference. Every time he finished a section of his explanation, he looked directly at me. Not the general. Not the procurement officers. Me. As if he was still trying to understand how the room had rearranged itself overnight. When he finished his financial overview, he closed his folder and waited. The room looked toward me. I asked the same question I would ask any contractor. Mr. Whitman, your cost projections assume a 12% reduction in component pricing over the next 18 months. Yes. What market analysis supports that assumption? He blinked slightly. It wasn't an aggressive question. It was simply the kind of detail evaluation officers are required to verify. Our supplier agreements anticipate that change, he replied. Do you have documentation for those agreements, I asked. He hesitated for half a second, then nodded. Yes. Please include them in the follow-up submission. Of course. The exchange lasted less than 30 seconds. But for my father, it was clearly something else. Because for the first time in his life, I was not the person being evaluated. He was. General Patterson leaned forward slightly. Colonel, any other questions from the review panel? I glanced toward the other officers. The logistics specialist spoke next. Then the legal advisor. The conversation moved forward again. 15 minutes later, the presentation concluded. The contractors closed their laptops and gathered their documents. General Patterson stood. Thank you for your time, he said calmly. We'll notify you once the evaluation is complete. The Whitman defense team began collecting their materials. Chairs shifted. Folders closed. But my father didn't move. He remained seated for a moment longer than the others. Then he stood slowly. The other members of his team filed toward the door. My father lingered behind them. The room emptied gradually. Officers stepped into the hallway. Analysts carried folders out toward the adjacent office. Within 2 minutes, only 3 people remained. General Patterson, my father, and me. The general gathered his notes. Colonel, he said I'll leave the follow-up requests with you. Yes, sir. He nodded toward my father politely. Mr. Whitman. Then he stepped out into the corridor, closing the door behind him. The room became very quiet. My father looked at me. Not the way he had at dinner. Not the way he had when I was 18. This time his expression carried something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. You could have told me, he said finally. His voice wasn't angry, just stunned. I closed the evaluation folder calmly. Told you what? That you were this. He gestured vaguely toward my uniform, toward the rank on my shoulders. I held his gaze evenly. You never asked. He shook his head slowly. All these years? Yes. You just let me believe. You decided what to believe, I said quietly. The words weren't harsh. They were simply true. He looked around the conference room as if trying to understand how everything had shifted. You're the one approving this contract. I'm the one reviewing it. That's not the same thing. Number. He studied my face. You could reject it. Yes. The weight of that realization settled between us. He exhaled slowly. For the first time in my life, my father looked like a man who didn't know what the next move was supposed to be. And strangely, I didn't feel victorious. Just calm. Because the truth hadn't arrived through revenge. It had arrived through reality. And reality doesn't need to raise its voice. For a long moment after the door closed behind General Patterson, neither of us spoke. The quiet inside the conference room felt different from the quiet at the dinner table the night before. There, silence had been uncomfortable, something people tried to fill with jokes or polite laughter. Here, the silence felt honest. My father stood across the table, one hand resting on the back of his chair. The confidence he usually carried like armor had loosened. Not gone, just shifted into something less certain. You're really a colonel, he said finally. It wasn't a question. No, I replied calmly, I'm really a colonel. The distinction mattered. He let out a slow breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. All these years, he said quietly, and you never thought to mention it. I closed the folder in front of me and stacked the documents neatly. I mentioned it once. His brow furrowed slightly. At the charity event, when General Avery called me Colonel Carter. He thought about that for a moment. Then he nodded, slowly remembering. Yes, he said, I remember that. He paused. But I thought he was exaggerating. The words might have been insulting once. Now they just sounded tired. You've always believed the version of the story that makes the most sense to you, I said. He ran a hand through his hair. You could have corrected me. I did. When? Every time you asked what I did and I answered honestly? He gave a short, frustrated laugh. That's not the same thing. It is in the army. The room fell quiet again. Through the window beside the conference table, the morning sun was beginning to rise over the river. The light spread slowly across the buildings outside, turning the glass of nearby offices gold. My father followed my gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at me. You're really the one deciding whether my company gets that contract. I'm one of the officers reviewing it. But your recommendation matters. Yes. He nodded slowly, absorbing that. For decades, my father had been the one controlling the terms of every conversation between us. He had been the one defining success. Now the balance had shifted. And he wasn't sure how to stand inside that new reality. You're not going to reject it just because of me, are you? He asked. His tone wasn't defensive. It was careful, professional, almost respectful. I met his eyes. Number. He studied my face for a long moment, trying to decide whether he believed that. Finally, he nodded. That sounds like you. I leaned back slightly in my chair. The Army doesn't make decisions based on personal feelings. That's not how business works, he said. I know. He folded his arms. You could make this very difficult for us. I could. And you won't. Number. He exhaled slowly again, this time with something closer to relief. Then he said something I hadn't expected. I suppose I underestimated you. The sentence hung in the air. It wasn't an apology. My father wasn't the kind of man who apologized easily. But it was the closest he had ever come. You didn't underestimate me, I said. He raised an eyebrow. No, you just never paid attention. The truth of that seemed to settle on him like weight. He looked down at the conference table for a moment. When did it happen? He asked quietly. When did what happen? When did you become this person? I thought about the question. It was strange hearing it now after all these years. There wasn't a moment, I said. He looked up. What do you mean? It was a lot of moments. Training exercises in the rain. Late-night briefings in rooms that smelled like stale coffee. Decisions where other people's lives depended on whether I stayed calm. The Army had a way of shaping people slowly. You build it piece by piece, I said. Build what? Respect. He nodded thoughtfully. In business, we call that reputation. Not exactly the same thing. He tilted his head slightly. How is it different? Reputation is what people think about you, I said. Respect is what they trust you to do. He considered that. Then he glanced again at the insignia on my shoulders. Those eagles, he said quietly. Yes. You earned those. Yes. Another silence passed between us. This one felt less tense. Almost reflective. Finally, my father picked up his briefcase from the table. I should go, he said. The rest of my team is probably wondering where I disappeared to. They're probably reviewing their presentation notes, I replied. He smiled faintly. You always did take things seriously. Yes. He hesitated near the door. Then he turned back toward me. For what it's worth, he said slowly, I never expected you to fail. That surprised me. No, I just expected you to come back eventually. To the company? Yes. I nodded. I figured that. He studied my face one last time. Well, he said, I suppose you found your own version of success. I didn't answer right away. Then I said the only thing that felt honest. I found my own version of purpose. He considered that difference. Then he opened the door. As he stepped into the hallway, he paused for half a second. Not long enough to say anything else, just long enough to look back at me one last time. And for the first time in my life, my father looked at me the way he looked at people he respected. The building felt different after my father left. Not quieter. Pentagon offices are never quiet for long. Phones ring, boots echo in hallways, printers hum somewhere behind closed doors. The machine of government keeps moving whether anyone notices or not. But something inside me had shifted. Not triumph, not relief. Just a sense that a long, quiet chapter of my life had finally turned a page. I stayed in the conference room a few minutes longer, reviewing the follow-up notes from the evaluation team. Procurement reviews don't end with dramatic moments. They end with paperwork. Clarifications requested. Technical data verified. Risk assessments filed. By 10:30, the room was empty again. I gathered my folders and stepped into the hallway. The liaison officer from the dinner the night before was standing near the elevators. He looked up and gave a small smile. "Morning, Colonel." "Morning." He hesitated. I wasn't sure how last night was going to go. Neither was I. He chuckled softly. "Your father seemed surprised." "That's one way to describe it." The elevator arrived with a soft chime. We stepped inside. After the doors closed, he glanced at my shoulder insignia. "For what it's worth," he said, "most people in that room respect the hell out of you." I nodded politely. "Respect isn't the goal." "No. Number." He seemed curious. "Then what is doing the job correctly?" The elevator reached the lobby. We stepped out into the bright morning sunlight spilling through the glass entrance. Washington was fully awake now, traffic moving, government workers crossing the plaza with coffee cups in hand. Life continuing exactly as it always did. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from an unknown number. I opened it. It was from my father. Just one sentence. "How long have you been a colonel?" I stared at the screen for a moment. Then I typed back, 3 years. The response came a minute later. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" I thought about that question carefully. There were many possible answers, but only one that felt honest. "You never asked." I put the phone back in my pocket and walked toward the parking lot. The day continued. Meetings. Reports. Emails. By late afternoon, the evaluation panel had already begun discussing the contract recommendation. Whitman Defense Systems had submitted a strong proposal. Technically sound. Competitive pricing. Reliable manufacturing partners. None of that had anything to do with my father. And everything to do with the team he had built. 2 weeks later, the contract review board finalized its decision. Whitman Defense Systems received the award. The email notification went out to the entire evaluation chain. Professional. Concise. Objective. Exactly the way those decisions are supposed to happen. Later that evening, my phone rang. My father. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Then I answered. "Hello." He cleared his throat. I saw the contract notice. "Yes." "You recommended approval?" "Yes." There was a pause. "I wasn't sure you would." "Why wouldn't I?" He didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, "Because of everything. The Army doesn't work that way. I'm beginning to understand that." The conversation fell quiet. Then he said something I had waited years to hear. "I'm proud of you." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of decades. "Thank you," I said. Another pause. "I meant what I said earlier," he added. "I underestimated you." I smiled faintly. "That's not unusual." He laughed softly. "No," he admitted, "it's not." We talked for a few more minutes about ordinary things. The contract timeline. Daniel's work at the company. Nothing dramatic. Nothing emotional. Just two adults having a conversation for the first time in a very long time. When the call ended, I sat quietly for a moment. The city lights outside my apartment window reflected against the dark glass. For years I had imagined that moment would feel like victory. Like some kind of final confirmation that I had proven him wrong. But it didn't feel like that at all. It felt peaceful. Because the truth about respect isn't what most people think. Respect isn't something a parent hands to a child like an inheritance. It's something built quietly, piece by piece, through the choices a person makes when no one is watching. The Army had taught me many things. Discipline. Leadership. Responsibility. But the most important lesson had nothing to do with rank. It was this: you don't earn respect by demanding it. You earn it by becoming the kind of person who doesn't need to. And sometimes, the people who doubted you the most are simply the last ones to see who you've become. If this story reminded you of a moment in your own life, a time when someone underestimated you, or when patience mattered more than proving a point, I'd love to hear about it. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Stories like this remind us that quiet perseverance often speaks louder than any argument ever could. And if you enjoy hearing stories about strength, family, and the long road to respect, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one. There are many more journeys like this waiting to be told. Let's keep walking them together.